Hello everybody and welcome to Parks Bros. It's Drew here, and today we're going to be heading to Mason, Ohio for their amazing amusement park, Kings Island, to rank, rate, and review every single one of their coasters. So just to catch you up a little bit, if you haven't watched all of our Kings Island reviews thus far, we've done full in-depth reviews on most of their major coasters like Orion, Mystic Timbers, Diamondback, The Beast, and even Banshee, which means it's time to finally rank, rate, and review them in less than 1 minute each before we head on to reviewing the next park in our list. At the time of recording this video, there are 14 roller coasters at Kings Island, with a 15th being added within the next couple of months, called Snoopy's Soapbox Racers, which I'm sure is going to be an absolute joy to ride, and I'll give my thoughts on that when we get to that point. Before we get to there though, I'm going to spend less than a minute on each of these 14 coasters describing how I feel about them, before suggesting how experienced of a coaster rider you should be before hopping onto them, and then of course giving my personal rating out of 10, at least for those rides that I've ridden. So without further ado, let's rank, rate, and review all the coasters at Kings Island. First up is the smallest coaster at the park, the Great Pumpkin Coaster, an E&F Miler kiddie coaster, which I sadly did not get the chance to ride. However, this fairly small coaster is probably perfect for any first-time coaster rider, as it at most goes up 10 feet into the air, and I guarantee goes less than 15 miles an hour. It looks very cute, it looks very fun. The layout is quite simple with a twisting drop and a couple of bunny hills, but again, there's absolutely nothing wrong with this coaster, at least from what I could see off-ride, but it's just not nearly as exciting as others. I would definitely say this is one of those coasters that could be your first, be any type of rider, beginner and up. Next up is Woodstock's Air Rail, another coaster I was not able to check out on my 3 days at Kings Island, and that's mainly just because this ride has quite the lengthy wait if you don't go straight to it, because it only runs one train. This inverted roller coaster is a little bit more terrifying than others, just because the track is above you as well as it gets a little bit taller, but judging by other rides of this type that I've been on, it lands itself at number 13 on my list. This is another ride I would definitely argue is a beginner coaster though, but I would highly recommend riding Great Pumpkin Coaster and even Woodstock Express before checking this out. At number 12 is a coaster I was actually able to ride at the other end of the park. This is their inverted boomerang coaster in Vertigo. Now, I will say this ride is very 50-50, and that's because the seats are both forwards and backwards facing. Now, I can say for my friends' rides on it, they had a much more enjoyable experience, as it seemed like it was fairly smooth, but for me, on a different car, facing in a different direction, it was pretty dang rough. After going through the first half of the ride cycle, I was already ready to hop off the train because, man oh man, it was not very enjoyable to me. I love the idea of going forwards and backwards on the same train though, so you kind of get to pick your poison, but just know this ride is not a guaranteed fun time, and I would say definitely be an experienced coaster rider for this, as it goes upside down technically 6 different times, and it goes forwards and backwards. And out of 10, I'd give it a 4. Up next, we're heading back to Camp Snoopy for Woodstock Express, their family and kid-friendly ride, and the perfect first wooden coaster to experience. This ride is not very rough at all, especially for a wooden coaster. It goes up and down quite a few little hills, and it's pretty dang enjoyable. I would say it's the perfect step up from the Great Pumpkin Coaster, as it's not too high and as well as you're on top of the track. But to me, this ride is another beginner-friendly coaster, as well as I would give it a 6 out of 10. It's just pretty dang enjoyable. Now, this is probably where I would put Soapbox Racers if it existed and I had ridden it at this point in time, but it wouldn't shock me if it goes up just a couple spots as well. Instead, however, at number 10, we're going to be talking about one of the family coasters and our first launch coaster on the list, Backlot Stunt Coaster at the center of the park. Now, this ride is kind of interesting because it has quite a lot of theming in comparison to a lot of the rides at the park, including some potential fire effects and a couple tunnel portions. This Premier Rides ride shoots you out into a triple helix from the get-go. It's pretty impressive, and that moment itself is really great. However, a lot of the track profiling throughout the rest of the ride is pretty janky and not the most comfortable, especially considering how the seats feel. Premier Rides is not necessarily known for their amazing and ergonomic seats, and this ride is just another part of that list. I felt the small of my back having something stuck in it with the seat and how that was designed, and it only made the profiling a little more annoying. Don't get me wrong, the launch is fun, as well as the rest of the ride's theming is pretty dang cool with some intense moments here and there, but I will say you should be an intermediate coaster rider before checking this out, so check out all the coasters in Camp Snoopy first, and this should be a good step up from there. And out of 10, I'd give it a 6. Next up is a more intimidating Premier launch coaster in Flight of Fear. They're indoor coaster themed to aliens and kind of alluding to Area 51 in a way in the brand new section next to Orion. This ride's queue is actually pretty interesting as you even go up into a UFO, which is really cool. The station is awesome as well. However, the ride experience is kind of leaving a bit to the imagination as this launches you into complete darkness, or at least what you would assume to be complete darkness, before getting vaulted into multiple very intense inversions with some lighting all around. If you've ridden Space Mountain, imagine that, but 10 times more intense, as well as even more janky all around. Now, I will say this is one of the coasters I actually rode more than one time compared to the rest of the list, and the seats were a pretty big issue for me yet again, as there was even one ride I started losing feeling in my foot because of where the wheel well was and the ankle lap bar restraint that goes alongside the actual bar that sits on your lap. And of course, while pulling up to 4.5 Gs on these inversions, it just made for a really intense ride that kind of threw you all around. Don't get me wrong, it's pretty dang fun and the theming is really cool too. It's just a little rough around the edges. But with that said, you should definitely be an experienced coaster rider before checking it out, and out of 10, I'd give it a 7. At number 8, we technically have 2 different roller coasters. However, they race each other. That's right, it's the Racer, the legendary wooden coasters at the park that duel each other side by side off into the woods before turning right back around. Both these rides are really fantastic, and right before we visited, they were retracked pretty heavily. And this was most noticeable on the blue side in comparison to the red, where the blue actually felt almost like a steel coaster. It was so smooth in portions, where on the red we were just bumping around a little bit more. Nothing wrong with that whatsoever, as it was still a really fun time to be able to race in that fashion, as well as getting some nice floater airtime over every airtime hill. Don't get me wrong, it's not the most exciting thing in the world, but man oh man, it is just so fun. And I would say be an intermediate coaster rider for this one. I think the scariest thing about it is the fact that it is a little bit taller and faster than most of the other coasters that are less intense than this. And I would give the red side a 7 and the blue side an 8 out of 10. At number 7, we're going to one of the coasters that I feel like isn't known about enough, as it's kind of all the way in the middle of nowhere compared to the rest of the park, and that's their aero suspended coaster, the Bat. This thing truly feels like it's in the middle of the woods, as well as being fairly unhinged with its suspended nature, meaning they're free swinging seats underneath the track. This, alongside a pretty intense layout all around after that first drop, is really impressive and creates kind of a scary atmosphere, especially in the middle of the night. The trek is long to get to this ride, but man, it is worth it. My only real complaint about this ride, outside of maybe a little bit of roughness for some, is the fact that it is on the shorter side. It does end fairly quick, which I think is a bummer, but man oh man, it packs a punch in the time that it's actually going throughout this track. I really do enjoy it though. I think it's my favorite suspended coaster I've been on to date. But with that said, I think you should be an experienced coaster rider for this one, and out of 10, I give it an 8. At number 6 is probably a surprise for some, but another aero roller coaster, a mine train coaster specifically, Adventure Express. Now, when I rode it, it was in 2022, so it didn't have some of the upgraded theming that it does now, but man oh man, this ride is just super fun and has some really great elements hidden throughout. There's multiple lift hills, but you start off dropping out of the station, which is always an amazing experience. You go through multiple themed tunnels that kind of allude to an Indiana Jones-like theme. This ride is super long, has a little bit of lovable jank that just kind of makes it feel a little bit unhinged, and while yes, the ride ends on a low note, overall, it's still fantastic. I would say you should be an intermediate coaster rider before checking this out. I'd even recommend riding this before the Racer, potentially, if you're scared of heights especially. especially, and out of 10, I'd give it an 8. At number 5 is probably the most famous or infamous roller coaster in the entire park's history, the longest wooden coaster in the world, the Beast. Now, this ride also features multiple lift hills as well as feeling like you're in the middle of the woods. Don't get me wrong, this ride is absolutely legendary, and it's number 5 on the list, which I think should tell you a lot about the rides upcoming. I will say the day ride and night ride are very, very different, and if you haven't seen my full in-depth review, I talk about that more in that video, but it's so different, in fact, that I feel like they're completely different rides altogether. In the day, it's not the most enjoyable thing, but it is so long and has some really great moments every once in a while that it makes up for it. However, at night, you don't really get a sense of where you're going exactly, especially once you get out into the middle of the woods. There's tunnels that I thought were never ending, and helixes that weren't actually helixes. The speed feels doubled, and it's even more unhinged. I will say you should be an experienced rider in day or night because it is just so long and kind of intimidating. And out of 10, I'd give the day ride an 8. But the night ride a 9. That brings us to our top 4, which will bring us just across the way to Diamondback, the B&M hypercoaster at the park. This over 200-foot tall ride just brings all the amazing floater airtime you could ever ask for. It can be pretty intimidating as it kind of stands tall against that entire side of the park and then drops right over the midway. It goes through countless airtime hills that will just lift you out of your seat ever so gently, maybe bringing a couple butterflies to your stomach, as well as adding a couple of small turns as well as a couple of helixes before splashing down in a beautiful pond that just adds this amazing finale moment. It's a really great ride all around. I just think it needs a little bit more variety and it would be placed higher on this list. However, you cannot go wrong with it, and I know many people think it's the best ride in the park. For me though, I would say you should definitely be an experienced rider just because that height can be very intimidating, and out of 10 I'd give it a 9. At number 3 is another B&M coaster. However, it's at the other end of the park and you flip the track to be above you. That's right, Banshee is at my number 3 spot. This is arguably the most intense B&M inverted coaster I've been on, and the layout just feels massive. This around 200-foot tall roller coaster dives back down towards the ground to the point where you feel like your feet are gonna touch the gravel. There's fantastic, huge inversions all around the ride, as well as pulling almost 5 Gs multiple times. The eerie theming adds into all of this horror and excitement that only this ride brings, at least in this vibe at the park. While it is very intense and probably the most intense ride in terms of forces at the entire park, it is quite rough in specific seats and rows throughout the days. So don't be surprised with a little bit of shaking and the potential of maybe a headache if you're more susceptible to that type of feeling giving you a headache. But with that said, this ride is absolutely phenomenal, and I would say be at least an experienced rider, if not a very experienced rider, as I would still say it's the most intense ride at the park, and out of 10, I'd give it a 9. For number 2, we're going to head back to another wooden coaster at the park, the newest one, Mystic Timbers. This GCI roller coaster has some amazing 1980s theming with overgrowing vines all the way around, and it helps that you traverse that type of terrain all the way into the back of the woods while going through a tunnel as well as ending in a mysterious shed. Now, talking outside of the theming, of course, there is just amazing moments all around this roller coaster. There's non-stop quick turns and amazingly paced airtime that ends up gently throwing you around all over the place, or maybe not so gently when it comes to nighttime. This is probably one of the most re-rideable rides in the park as well, which just helps it that much more. It's fantastic and would be my favorite ride in the park if it wasn't for number 1, but let's just say this: be an experienced rider just because it does throw you around quite a bit in comparison to other rides, and out of 10, I'd give it a 10. That moves us to number 1, and that is their B&M Giga coaster with a 300-foot tall drop, Orion. This thing gets you over 90 miles an hour and gives you some amazing speed, more speed than any ride at the park, and I think that's what really puts this ride above everything else for me, as well as the variability between elements. There's not really one element that's alike another, and they all stand out in a really nice way. The theming is fairly loose on this ride in comparison to other rides at the park, as you are visiting a top secret alien facility, and it's right next next to Flight of Fear, so all the theming ties in really well in that area, and it's fantastic. But the ride really shines once you start going up that lift hill and crest that 287-foot top height, and then get some incredible floater, if not ejector airtime, going all the way down 300 feet. After that, there's some immense positive G's before being floated out of your seat again, repeating that process a couple of times with a speed hill and one of the most amazing floater airtime moments in its larger airtime hill, and then pulling 10 seconds of straight positive G's and then getting a little bit of ejector to cap it all off. This ride has a little bit of everything while averaging at least 85 miles an hour, and it's got to take that #1 spot for me. I would say definitely be an experienced coaster rider just because that heightened speed is super intimidating, I know, for many people. I will say it's the perfect next step from Diamondback because it's just a taller and faster version of that, but with just better elements all around. And out of 10, you know it, this is a 10 out of 10. So please, what do you think of my ratings, rankings, and reviews of all of these coasters at Kings Island? Do you agree? And I'd love to find out, what's your favorite coaster at the park? Let me know down in the comments below. And I want to say thank you all so much for watching, leaving your comments, and enjoying the previous reviews from this park. And if you haven't checked those out, make sure to do so. But of course, thank you all so much again for watching. I really do appreciate it. And until next time, we'll see you on the next ride.